So tonight I want to introduce two different philosophical concepts, both of which I think are my invention. Let me know in the comments section if you've already heard of these things or if there's already some name for these ideas. And those two concepts are the 3 tiers of argumentation and Mike's rule. As I said, I believe I've come up with these things, so that's why Mike's rule is named after me, because why not? So this is how this is going to work. I'm going to explain what the 3 tiers are. I'm going to give the examples that I normally give for those 3 tiers, and then I'm going to actually have video to show of the town council meeting from last Monday night that actually perfectly illustrates what these 3 tiers are, and then perfectly demonstrates Mike's rule. So briefly, what are the 3 tiers of argumentation? This is a concept that I think encompasses all arguments. I believe that all arguments fall into one of 3 categories that I think are hierarchical in their strength. So the highest tier of argumentation is arguments on principle. The highest tier of argumentation are arguments on principle. The second tier below that are arguments on practice, and then the lowest tier is arguments on optics. So what do they mean? An argument on principle is one where you've presented a principle and you're arguing the should, the ought, based on a core principle. These arguments are incredibly strong because they can't be taken down by themselves, and they can't be taken down by something like an external condition. You have to introduce an entirely new argument, or you have to prove that the argument itself is fallacious, which means that you have to have outside argumentation to tear down this argument. Which is why these are the strongest arguments, because again, the arguments themselves are incredibly rigid. They're also incredibly predictable, and they're incredibly consistent because you can apply that concept to other things, that principle, to other things, and know what the conclusion ought to be based on that principle. Below that are arguments in practice. What does that mean? That means you're making a practical argument. These arguments are not as strong as arguments on principle because the argument can be used against itself if you so much as change external conditions. Whatever the thing in practice that's being practiced is, if that thing changes, then you can dismantle the argument on practice. We'll get into examples in just a moment here. And the lowest level are arguments on optics. These are arguments that make a claim towards what will a thing look like? How will this make us look? Do you want to have us look like this? And the example that I typically use to break down those 3 tiers are, should you steal the medicine, right? We don't need to go into great detail about the conditions of the medicine, but the argument on principle would be, no, stealing is wrong. Therefore, you shouldn't steal the medicine. Not only is this argument incredibly consistent, because what you can do is say, no, you shouldn't steal the baseball bat. Stealing is wrong, so you shouldn't steal the baseball bat. You shouldn't steal the car, because stealing is wrong. Therefore, you shouldn't steal the car. You shouldn't steal the bagel, because stealing is wrong. Therefore, you shouldn't steal the bagel. So now you either have to prove that the argument itself is fallacious, and then this is going to head down a very deep and difficult metaethics conversation about whether or not stealing in general is a moral wrong. This is a very difficult task that you're going to have to go through, and you're usually not going to be able to say that stealing itself is either wrong or right without having to break down those circumstances. And in this case, we're talking about stealing medicine. So there's a tier below that would be, no, you shouldn't steal the medicine because right across the street is another pharmacy that sells the exact same medicine for a lot cheaper, and you can afford that. So just go buy it from that other store. Well, here we can change the external condition, which is, well, what if that other pharmacy across the street doesn't exist? Well, now what? Now you're implying that it is okay to steal the medicine so long as that other pharmacy right across the street doesn't exist. So I can use that same argument. Right, he shouldn't steal the medicine if there isn't a pharmacy right across the street that sells it for an affordable price. Therefore, since that pharmacy doesn't exist, that second pharmacy doesn't exist, he should steal the medicine. And that's the weakness of that argument. Now, it is still stronger than arguments on optics, because an argument on optic would be something along the lines of, you shouldn't steal the medicine because, man, it would look really bad on you to have that on your criminal record. Or, man, I don't want to live in one of these towns where people are stealing stuff or stealing medicine. I mean, that's just not going to look good. We're trying to attract people to our town. It's not going to look good on us to have that. In that case, I can completely disregard the argument. I don't care what I look like. I need the medicine. I'm stealing the medicine. Or you can say, I don't care what the community looks like. I need the medicine and I need to live. Therefore, I'm going to go get the medicine. I just don't care about the optics. Or you could just simply disagree with the optics, and then you don't have to present a new argument. You don't have to dismantle the argument itself. You can say things like, yeah, I do care about optics, but I think this is actually going to make me look good because screw that guy. That guy is just price gouging. Screw him. So in that case, the argument folds before there's really even a counter argument presented, before the argument itself can be dismantled. You don't even have to change the outside conditions. Perhaps there is another pharmacy across the street, but we're not even talking about that. We don't even have to bring that up. The conditions can remain the same, the argument can remain the same, and you can dismantle the argument. Now, I use this example because this is just the one that comes to mind, but interestingly, we had what I think is actually a better example, because people, when I explain this to folks, don't always quite understand what I'm talking about when I present these three tiers. And the example of should you steal the medicine is sometimes flies over people's heads. So what I want to actually bring forth now is a few clips from Monday night's town council meeting where we had this exact course play out in real life, so you guys can see with your eyes how these three arguments break down and examples of those three arguments in practice. And now these arguments are over a course of about 2.5 minutes. So I need to set up this video. First things first, there's what's being discussed at this town council meeting is the establishment of an opioid settlement committee. This would be a committee of volunteers that would oversee the distribution of settlement money from opioid cases. It's money that's coming in from, I think, the Fed and the state. It doesn't matter. It's coming in from a higher governing body, And the town is tasked with doling out that funding. So the town council decided to set up a committee. It doesn't matter. You don't need any more details than that, but there's a debate over whether or not the committee should be either a temporary committee or a permanent committee. The two people that are going to be making their case are, in this case, more people spoke during the meeting, but of the clips that you're going to see, the first clip you're going to see is from Councilman Chris Cosgrove, and then the second clip is going to be from Councilman Alexander Thomas. Let's watch. This is Councilman Chris Cosgrove. He's going to present both the argument on principle and the argument on practice in favor of the committee being temporary. He starts off with the argument on principle first, then presents the argument on practice. I'll play the whole clip first, then we'll break it down.
Should it be a temporary? Should it be a permanent? And I know we have in front of us one batch of money coming. It seems to me it was 60, 70,000,
70,000, 70,000,
000, something like that.
right.
And I guess in my mind, I'm usually biased towards keeping a committee temporary unless it's absolutely necessary to make it permanent. Because when it's permanent, a couple reasons. If we don't get any more money after this, now we've got people who may have to be reappointed and there's nothing on their agenda. And two, the other thing is when committees become permanent, line items on the budget kind of sneak up. I guess I would just propose we make it a temporary committee. If we get more money comes in, we can then make it a permanent later, something. I don't know.
Let's listen to that first part again.
Should it be a temporary? Should it be a permanent? And I know we have in front of us one batch of money coming. It seems to me it was 60, 70,000, 000, something
right.
like that.
Right.
And I guess in my mind, I'm usually biased towards keeping a committee temporary unless it's absolutely necessary to make it permanent. Because when it's permanent, yeah, a couple reasons. If we don't get any more money after this, now we've got people who may have to be reappointed, and there's nothing on their agenda. And two, the other thing is when committees become permanent, line items on the budget kind of sneak up.
I'm usually biased towards keeping a committee temporary unless it's absolutely necessary to make it permanent, because when it's permanent,
line items on the budget kind of sneak up.
Here he's arguing, in short, permanent committees come with baggage by their very nature. This is an argument against permanent committees, period, and you can apply this to all committees. This isn't to say temporary committees should never exist, as there may be other arguments to counter this one, but it's an argument you can consistently and evenly apply to all committees, and you can know going in what to expect in terms of argumentation for or against the tenure of a committee. It also requires presenting an entirely separate argument to counter it, and the argument itself must either be proved fallacious or it will hold. This is the strength of an argument on principle. Let's re-listen to the second half of this clip.
I guess I would just propose we make it a temporary committee. If we get more money comes in, we can then make it a permanent later, something. I don't know.
This is a practical argument. I have to add some context here that would require you watching about 10 minutes of this very dry meeting otherwise, so bear with me. The argument Chris is here presenting is that the committee should be temporary because this may be all the funds we get, and it would simply be easier, if these are all the funds we get, to operate within the framework of a temporary committee. This argument can be countered with itself because it implies that further funding would necessitate the committee being permanent. All we have to do is change the conditions outside the argument to dismantle the argument. We don't even have to prove the fallaciousness of the argument itself. If I can prove to you that there is zero reason to expect we won't get more funding, then your own argument implies the committee should be permanent. Now let's listen to Alexander Thomas's response.
Actually, Chris, thank you, because now I would want it to be permanent because it would show a commitment on the part of the town to a long-term solution for the opioid issues in town. It would be more of not just that money, but you said it might show up in the budgetary process, etc. Maybe we do need to make a stronger commitment also during budgetary times toward helping the opioid crisis.
It would show a commitment on the part of the town to a long-term solution. I couldn't conceive of a better example of an argument on optics than this. Showing a commitment, ostensibly to the voters, is giving an optic to the voters that implies said commitment. In short, this will make us look good to, well, at least someone. The weakness of this argument is that you don't even need the argument itself or outside conditions to dismantle it. You can simply say either, I don't care about optics, you do what is right and good, because it is right and good, votes be damned. Or something along the lines of, I disagree. I think it does show a commitment to a long-term solution because it demonstrates that we are going to not be so narrow-minded and refocus our energies once this funding source is dried up. What's interesting is that Chris's initial argument is simply breezed over, even by those who actually agree with him in the conclusion that the committee should be temporary rather than permanent. Instead, what they are mostly arguing is on practice. There's further arguments along the lines of, it's easier to go from temporary to permanent than it is to go from permanent to temporary. So what we should do is start off with a temporary committee, and then if we need to expand, we can expand. This is an argument on practice in that if it were easier to establish if you could actually argue that it was either not easier or just as easy to bring a permanent committee from permanent to temporary, or even easier to bring a permanent committee to temporary than to bring a temporary committee to permanent, God, that's a mouthful, then the argument falls apart. Because now what you have is again, you've changed the outside conditions, or you've proved a difference in outside conditions, and you can then use the argument to say, no, it actually should be permanent, not temporary. The other half of this is that the proverbial dames, the three Democrats that are on the town council, they all seem to actually agree with Chris's argumentation. Again, they don't even bring up his argument on principle. Chris doesn't even bring up his argument on principle later on. Instead, they focus entirely on the practical side of these arguments, and they counter with, yes, we agree, but, and then they say, we've been won over by Alexander Thomas's argument on optics. In this case, it seems like, if we're to trust their word, it seems like Alexander Thomas's argument on optics actually won over the other two Democrats in the room. In this case, although the argument is weaker, it seems to have been more effective. Additionally, the fact that the argument on principle isn't even brought up, and the entire rest of this debate, which went on for a long time after this, I want to say it was 20 or 25 minutes, was focused on the arguments on principle and then countered with the arguments on optics. So this kind of naturally leads us to Mike's rule. And your guys are not going to like this, but I just showed you the clips where, these are being presented. Alexander Thomas starts right off with, I agree with your arguments on practice, but what I'm going to lean on is a counter argument on optics. So in this case, again, she agrees with Chris's arguments, but believes that the stronger argument, the argument that's more effective on her in her conclusion, is the argument on optics, which is why she wants it to be a permanent committee. If not for the argument on optics, she would agree with Chris that it should be a temporary committee. In this case, she's leaning on that argument on optics. That's the argument that's winning her over. Mike's rule is that the strength of an argument is inversely proportional to the effectiveness of an argument. What does that mean? Well, when I tell you, when somebody says, should you steal the medicine? And I respond with, no, stealing's wrong, you shouldn't steal the medicine. What's the retort going to be? Is it going to be a conversation about whether or not stealing is wrong? Is it going to be a conversation about the meta-ethics of stealing and what constitutes actually stealing? What is the thing within stealing that makes it good or bad? Maybe you're not even going to present the argument that stealing is good or bad. Maybe the argument you're going to present is instead of a deontological argument, which we'll have to talk about another time, your argument on the consequences of the thing. That stealing isn't necessarily bad because of the consequences of the thing. I don't care about the thing itself being wrong or right. What I care about are the consequences of the thing. And it's the consequences from which I draw the morality. That's where I get the principle from. Now, that's a really weak way of going about things. But in this case, when you present the arguments on principle, you don't usually get a response with another argument on principle. You either get a response on practice. Well, what if there's no way for this person to afford it? What if this is a life-saving medicine and you can't afford the life-saving medicine and there's no other way to get your hands on this life-saving medicine? This is an argument on practice because, well, what if it's not? What if I can demonstrate that it's actually not? What if I can demonstrate that there's a way to get your hands on this medicine without having to steal the medicine, right? Well, then the argument isn't a question then of whether or not stealing is wrong. It's a question of whether or not you can get your hands on the medicine. So either you're presenting a completely different argument or you're presenting an argument, in this case, on practice, which is a different tier of argumentation. And the final one, of course, is the arguments on optics. Won't somebody please think of the children? Is an argument on optics, and how often do you hear it? And how often are these arguments winning arguments? When it comes to convincing people, what I've seen is that these arguments on optics tend to be the strongest of arguments, and that right below that are arguments in practice. Even when it comes to things like voting for somebody. Are you voting for somebody because of this seems like a guy I'd like to have a beer with? That's an argument on optics. He seems like a cool guy. This guy seems like a nice guy. This guy seems like a jerk, so I'm voting against him. This is an argument on optics. An argument on practice would be something along the lines of, this guy is going to, I don't know, he's going to give me something, right? Like there's a thing that I like, and he's in favor of the thing that I like. So I'm going to vote for him being in favor of this thing that I like, right? That would be an argument on practice, I suppose. And then there would be the argument on principle. A practical argument. The better version of the practical argument actually would be, well, the guy he's running against, I can't agree with any of his policy positions. The guy that he's running against is going to be presenting the worst of all policy positions. And and I have no choice because I live in a swing state. I have to vote for this guy, even though there are other candidates that I think are better. I live in a swing state, so I've got to vote for this guy so that this guy beats the other guy. This would be an argument in practice, because what if you weren't in a swing state? What if this other guy, right, wasn't so bad? What in terms of policy? What if, would you be able to vote your gut then? And then there's the argument beyond that of, I voted for this person because this is the best candidate, and you should vote for the best candidate. Right? So there's no outside condition that you're changing, right? There's the argument maybe you would counter it with a different argument and say, well, no, you shouldn't just vote for the best candidate because, and then you would insert a different argument, which might be an argument on practice, which is you live in a swing state, and if this other guy wins this state, then this guy might actually get elected, right? You're throwing your vote away because your guy is just not going to get elected. Your third party candidate is just not going to get elected. And we need to make sure that this other guy doesn't get elected, and we're in a swing state. Well, what if we're not in a swing state? Right? Well, what if we're not in a swing state? Then I should be voting my conscience, right? Because you should vote your conscience. So in that case, again, you're getting a different argument. So, let me know in the comment section if this is just all crazy. I know this one's a lot longer than I normally like to keep these. So again, let me know what you guys think, especially of Mike's rule, which is that arguments, the strength of an argument is inversely proportional to its effectiveness. The stronger arguments aren't as effective at winning people over as the weaker arguments. So that's what we've been covering tonight. Let me know in the comment section if you think this is wild. Hope you guys have gotten something out of this, and we'll see you in the next one.